Sethuraman, Panchanathan, and Ellen Williams. You know, politics matters in physics. And so this panel is to try to make sure that the community understands where we are, what are the dangers, but also what are the opportunities. I'm especially grateful to Neal Lane. He and I and Bart worked together on a report called The Perils of Complacency. And for any physicist who wants to understand what those perils are, I encourage them to get a copy. With that note, I'm going to turn it over to Miles O'Brien.
Jim, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. And this group of panelists are scientific superheroes. And as I believe, actually, the term superhero was applied not long ago by the vice president in referencing science. Wow, what a difference an election can make. Science is at the center of policy once again, and perhaps might be higher than ever with the lead of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, now rising to cabinet status. Of course, the new president re-entering the United States into the Paris Accords, indicating that science and truth will be at the center of his philosophy: science, truth, justice, and the American way. Sounds like Superman right there. He wants to restore our faith in America's place as a frontier of science and discovery. If you take all this at face value, it's pretty amazing turn of events for those of us in the scientific world who have felt science has been largely ignored over the past 4 years at a time when we had very little luxury to do so. So what do we do about it? How do we turn all of that good rhetoric into some positive action that can change the dynamic, that can change the funding picture, and most importantly, can give us a way to marshal the amazing resources that we have at hand to solving some of these crises level problems that we're contending with. Of course, I'm thinking about the pandemic as well as climate change, and there are others which we'll talk about in the course of this next couple of hours. We're going to divide the panel into 2 sections just to manage it a little more easily. The first one will be more on the domestic policy legislative front, and then we'll kind of change the focal length to more of a global picture in the second part of the panel. So we hope you'll get some popcorn and sit back and relax. And most importantly, if you have a thought or a question, let us know about it. And I will do my best to integrate your questions and your thoughts into the conversation as we can. So we're going to start off with a former member of Congress and a current member of Congress and a former anchorman. So this is going to be hard. This will be a battle to see who gets a word in edgewise, right? So we've got Representative Bill Foster, a businessman, physicist. He's the, depending on how you count, either the sole or second PhD physicist in Congress, represents Illinois' 11th congressional district, and of course is on the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. His predecessor on that committee, former Representative Bart Gordon, 6th District of Tennessee. He's a lawyer, and by now he's an honorary scientist, given his tenure on that science committee. He's like me. I'm a history major. I just, if you keep showing up, it kind of sticks a little bit. And he's now a partner in the global law firm of K&L Gates and a distinguished fellow at the Council on Competitiveness. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. This is going to be a great opportunity to talk about what some of the legislative challenges and opportunities might be as we look ahead. But let's start with some basic stuff. Here we are in the middle of a pandemic, and it seems to me the pandemic itself and the extraordinary full court scientific press that gave us vaccines in about 9 months, which I don't think anybody here would have predicted. The conventional wisdom would never have given it a 9-month time frame. Seems to me that offers, first of all, an object lesson in the value of science and what science can do for us when it is marshaled in an appropriate way. I'd love to hear a couple of your thoughts on what it's been like watching this amazing response from the scientific community. Why don't you start with that, Bart?
Well, I think it's an inflection point for us that we need to take advantage of. Not only did it take science to solve the problem, but also I think we have to point out that it took years and years of preparation to get there. And this is just, there's going to be other problems. World Health Organization says the big one is not there yet. You have competitiveness. There's a lot of problems out there. And so let us use this as an example to show what science can do, because this puts a face on it. People can understand it.
Bill, do you think that kind of message is getting across? I mean, I suppose a potential silver lining out of something like a pandemic is people who have perhaps put a lot of skepticism into the scientific process might change their view of science. Do you see any evidence of that?
Yeah, I think that if we're lucky here, this can be an almost Sputnik-like moment in terms of really ramping up the national level of effort in science. COVID is part of it. There's just the incredible 60-day dash from the sequence of the spike protein going on the internet from China, and the first human being vaccinated with a prototype vaccine is an incredible story. And as Bart pointed out, the story really starts back in the early 90s when I think some researcher at the University of Wisconsin stuffed some RNA in a mouse to see if you get any protein expressed. And so then, this is an example of the really long-term payoff. And I think that people get that. They understand that the reason we're in a better position here than we are with the Spanish flu a century ago is science, full stop, and the technology that's developed, to make that happen. But it's more than just that. I think the international competition, which you'll be getting to later, is an important factor in the public perception. And even prior to COVID, there was this remarkable moment when the Republicans on the science committee came together and made a proposal to double the basic research budget. This was a Republican-only proposal that had clearance all the way up through the Republican leadership. And so, Bart will probably not recognize that as typical Republican behavior for most of his time there. But I think it really, represents an honest belief that, the future of our economy absolutely is tied to this. And the people get it, therefore the politicians do.
So Bart, I don't want to read too much into these things, but is that a potential sea change right there when you see that kind of support for science on the other side of the aisle?
It really is. Now, they had it over a 10-year period. I would like to see it doubled in 5 years, but I'd shake hands on 7, work together and get it done anytime.
All right, I love the Sputnik analogy. And, of course, if you love science and space, Sputnik did dramatically change the trajectory of this country. The difference, it seems to me, potentially, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, Bill, why don't you take this one, is we were that happened all in the context of Cold War rivalries with the Soviet Union at the time. In other words, there was a clear and present danger. Do you think that people view existential threats like the climate emergency in the same way, and thus will they support the kind of funding that is implied when you say Sputnik moment?
Well, I think so. I just got off an airplane where we spent $1.9 trillion of your money. And I was struck on the way back. Actually, that represents roughly 100 superconducting super colliders. Just so for those of you who are around then.
It's an interesting geeky increment of money, right? How many superconducting super colliders?
Yeah, of then year money. The inflation would change things a little, but not much. Yeah. But this is, people understand that big problems require big solutions, and I think they, to the extent the public really perceives this as a national crisis, which I think they do actually. Certainly, part of the Sputnik benefit to science came from competition with the Soviet Union, and I'm very proud that it was never in science all about competition. I worked at Fermi National Accelerator Lab. The very first experiment that was ever run at Fermi Lab back in the 1960s, at the very height of the Cold War, had Russian collaborators on it. And so we have to keep the channels open. If you think where we would be if we did not have the information from the spike protein from the Chinese laboratory to start designing our vaccines. If that had been left up to the governments, it wouldn't have happened, but the scientists transmitted the information. So we have to be careful to keep the scientific channels open while, trying to understand the economic implication of this and making sure that when scientific discoveries are made, that they accrue to the benefit of the free democracies of the world.
Wow, that's
Let me quickly add something.
Go ahead,
Certainly,
Bart.
climate change is important, and hopefully it's widely understood. But also, science is a part of innovation and a part of our economic infrastructure. And I think people can also, they see the challenge of other countries, and we don't want to have to be a country of minimum wage. We want to be a country on the cutting edge of new technologies. And so that's another reason that we have to invest for our economic benefit as well as the climate concerns.
Bart, the polling suggests that Americans really have turned a corner on climate. There's a lot less evidence of hardcore denialism. They accept that it's happening. Number one, we didn't have that for a while. They accept that human beings are linked to it, and we're at the cusp now. They feel like something needs to be done about it. But it is still a matter of priorities when you think of all the things that are potentially on the list of expenditures. Do you think, especially when you look on the other side of the aisle on this, do you think that there is this a galvanizing moment where you could have a conversation about maybe putting a price on carbon, for example?
Well, 10 seconds in front of you. I passed a lot of legislation when I was chairman of the Science Committee concerning climate change, but we never talked about climate change. We talked about energy independence. And so I think that President Biden really is framing this well. It's more than climate change, but it's an opportunity to invest in our alternative energy infrastructure, creating jobs. So we're doing more than just trying to deal with climate change. We're making America the leader in clean energy. And so I think he's framing it to get a bigger audience, which is good.
Well, it's a tough thing, isn't it, Bill? Because the fossil fuel industry for so long has framed it as this zero-sum game that basically it's either, hug the tree and lose your job or stick with fossil fuels, which is a completely false dichotomy, but it's been very difficult to get out around that public relations campaign. But, it seems to me, this is, never waste a good crisis, right? That whether it's a wildfire or flooding or increased hurricane strength, people are coming around to the idea that this is more of a clear and present danger. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. For example, the Republican proposal to double the basic research budgets, if you look at the press releases in there, it was one of the reasons to do that was climate change. And if you talk individually to Republican members, most of them, many of them at least, come from rural districts. And the farmers know the climate is changing. And they go back home and they say, yep, things are changing and not all it's good. And they understand the threat. That's, I think, one of the big drivers on the Republican side.
And if you want to really see an indicator, most all the big oil companies now are pledging to go to, increase their alternative energy. And some of them to the point they're saying they're going to get out of the fossil fuel business at a certain year. So they're seeing that it impacts their bottom line.
So
and famously, General Motors announced a date certain when they're going to stop making internal combustion engines.
That was amazing to me. And it's interesting how industry has gotten ahead of basically the legislative and lawmaking process. But if you think for about 5 minutes on it, you can understand why. General Motors is a global corporation. They have to sell cars in places where restrictions are different, and they basically have to meet those restrictions. And so to have a different set for the United States, it makes no sense from a business perspective.
It's also technology. The thing that's driving this is batteries are cheaper and higher capacity than they were before due to decades and decades of government-funded and industry-funded research. Back when I was in a grad school, everyone knew that electric cars would be cheaper except for the battery. And it was just in maybe 2009, I guess, when it seemed clear that batteries had reached a high enough level of performance that it was worth a government risk to make a $500 million loan to this startup called Tesla to see if you could actually get the economies of scale. And so, let's see, last I looked, it was about $500 billion market valuation of Tesla. So I think that's a pretty good return on investment for the country as a whole. But it was technology that did that.
I think the business community also is recognizing that consumers want to purchase from, good citizens, and they're trying to position themselves as good citizens. And so if you can buy one car here or get your energy somewhere else there, I think particularly younger folks want to reward good citizens, and they're trying to get in front of that.
Okay.
But it's easier if technology does it for you. For the crossover in the total cost of ownership between an electric and an internal combustion car is going to happen in the next 3 or so years. At that point, we're not going to have to argue about CAFE standards or even a carbon tax. People will go to electric cars because they're cheaper. And this avoids the tough part of the carbon tax that you mentioned, which is it's very hard to design one that doesn't land hard on rural areas. And because we have the rural, the rural urban political split, that makes it partisan.
The business case on cars is closing, and I think it's actually a better product overall. A couple questions on this front from the audience. They're all kind of related. Can we change emphasis from treatment to innovative preventative technologies? That's one question. But then further to the carbon tax, what about carbon dividend, i.e. tax cash collected is returned to residents? So it's kind of cap and trade. Is that viable or is it dead? In other words, I guess to take the regressive nature out of fixing a price on carbon, could there be ways to return it to people who would be disproportionately affected by a higher price for gasoline? Bart, do you want to do that?
We're not there quite yet, but we have to continue to stir the pot. I think everyone knows that it would be the quickest way to get to zero. But we're just not quite there yet politically and all, honestly, in my opinion.
What do you think, Bill?
What that does, it mixes two things. One is the problem with the maldistribution of wealth in our country, which is hurting economic growth very badly. And then the need to do something about carbon pollution. And now whether or not you can politically tie those two together, they're really orthogonal problems, but maybe politically by bundling them together, you can make them at least growth neutral and avoid the real costs of that you're imposing, particularly on rural people. The best thing you can do to lower your carbon footprint is probably to move to a city, but that's not a popular argument in half of the congressional districts of the United States.
Or we could all move to our living rooms on Zoom. We could try that. That's worked out pretty well, I guess. So, before we shift into talking about the gaps and the areas where the United States needs to up the ante, it does seem to me that the progress that you just described, whether it's batteries, climate change, all the things that are going on there, you can pick almost anything you like. We tend to bemoan the scientific enterprise for lack of funding on a federal level. How would you characterize the state of the scientific enterprise right now, especially when you look at the basic science and federally funded science that is at, really kind of the seed corn kind of stuff? Are we in as bad a shape as we think, or does the amazing response to the vaccine prove things are better than we think? Bart?
Oh, yeah.
You want to do Bart first?
Well, okay. I think you have to say compared to what?
Mm-hmm.
You have to keep in mind that Russia and China and Europe, they weren't all that far behind us in coming up with their vaccines. So, where do we stand as we were in the 50s and 60s and 80s? The rest of the world is catching up. So I would say that if you look at our scientific enterprise, I would say it's like a house with good bones. We have good institutions, but we're getting behind, and it needs to be retrofitted and brought up, with additional funding and public support.
Bill?
Yeah, and I think we also have to look at, there's something about our economy that gives all of the economic benefits to the people at the very end of the pipeline. All the Mark Zuckerbergs, who's, he's not really an integrated circuit designer or a solid state physicist, although he benefits tremendously from it. And yet it's the end of the pipeline that seems to be rewarded by our economic system. We have to understand that. And if there are any non-governmental ways to, make that happen, because that's crucial.
You know, it seems to me that we have taken our eye off the ball here, and we've sort of we've been reading our clippings too much and assume that we're an exceptional nation and forget that being exceptional requires constant work and diligence. I'm curious if you have some thoughts, both of you, on how is it that the rest of the world has learned the lesson of the magic of our scientific public-private enterprise, and we seem to be forgetting it. What's happening there? What's behind all that, Bart?
Well, as you say, they've seen our formula. They have envied it, and they are trying to replicate it. And some, or a particular country, is trying to jumpstart it by, stealing some of our, best science. So, they give them credit. They saw us and they learned the lesson. And some other countries have a more monolithic approach to being able to govern and can make choices, if you want to say winners and losers, and also funding.
Bill?
Yeah, there's almost a design problem with democracy, that unless it has a high probability of affecting the next election, politicians don't want to think about it. All right, and that causes us to systematically underinvest in things like long-term basic scientific research. And so the only way around that is to very consciously, promote and vote for people that are willing to put that forward.
Democracy is kind of a two-edged sword, isn't it? The messy democracy can slow down a lot of good progress on some things, but we have done it before. Obviously, World War II comes immediately to mind. We mentioned Sputnik moments. I think we sort of are fingers crossed, hoping this might be one of those moments, but it does require, what's that expression that Winston Churchill said, that you can count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possible option. I feel sometimes like we just get trapped in that. It's got to be a burning building, right, Bart?
Well, yes, but we also need leadership and talking about from the top. And I think now we're going to have leadership that's going to put science at the top. Clearly already President Obama announced, President Biden announced that the OSTP director, as you pointed out, will be raised to a cabinet level so that science can be integrated into all the decisions. And also some of the problems that we face, they're not just in one silo. They can be, multiple disciplines. So I'm very optimistic that we're going to have an advocate, a bully pulpit that's going to be advocating and demonstrating why science is important and the investment there is important.
So you referenced China there, Bart. I mean, should the U.S., Bill, be more aggressive, going on the offensive as it tries to maintain its scientific primacy, or should it be looking to build more multinational partnerships, or both?
Well, I think the most effective thing we can do is to make ourselves a welcoming place for foreign scientists to come in and spend their career. We benefited after World War II. We benefited tremendously from the influx of largely European scientists who, for a generation carried and accelerated the U.S. enterprise in so many ways. And so we have to do that. It's one of the reasons that one of the pieces of legislation I introduced is basically a proposal to staple a green card to a PhD diploma for a scientist who wants to stay and work here. And so that's part of it. And, we put in place, following World War II, deliberate policies to gently push scientists and university graduates back to their home countries to avoid the brain drain. And so I think that's one of the things that we have to think again about. We have to, I think, promote a brain drain in its natural direction. And we have to, clean up our act to the extent possible in terms of just treating science and scientific integrity with the respect it deserves.
How much damage has been done when you start talking about these H1B visas and the Trump administration policy toward that? And is it something, I know the Biden administration is making statements that it's going to try to clean this up, but it's a big mess, isn't it?
It is. And I'm going to give you an example of that. A while back, I was talking to the head of of a university in another English-speaking country. And they were saying about how they used to try to recruit, again, the best and brightest from around the world, but they could, they were all going to go to America. Now we're pushing them out, and so they're coming to them. And so we're seeing consequences in the short term, and it's certainly going to impact us in the long term.
What is
and the great leveler has been the internet. Everything scientific is online, and the internet's just as good in any country of the world than it is here.
So with that, the fact that we're having this conversation this way, indicates that the tyranny of geography is not what it once was. Is it perhaps an anachronism to think that people will come here and just automatically stay? And is there a way we can incentivize that? How do we make this happen in a world where it's just as easy to do science in Bangalore as it is here in the United States?
Go ahead, Bill.
Well, I think one of the things we can do in terms of immigration law is to find a way to get the spouses of scientists to have an easy way to remain in the United States, because that's it's very well known. It's called the two-body problem in universities, and it's a very, it's a real effect. And one of the reasons why you have these hubs at Boston, Bay Area, other places, is simply that's where your spouse can also get a job. And we have to make sure that for the entire family of a STEM graduate, that there's a reasonable path to employment as well. So we have to think it through from a family point of view when we finally get to comprehensive immigration reform, which I hope happens. It's a high priority for the Biden administration.
Well, another point there is that, yes, you can do science anywhere in the world, but it's science that leads to innovation. Innovation then leads to new products and jobs. And I think the United States is still has a better ecostructure for allowing those scientists to take, their work and then become innovators. And so I think we have an advantage in that regard.
Well, we do have a secret sauce, I think. I think people have tried to copy us, but there's still some things here that haven't been emulated. Would you agree with that?
We can always do better.
Yeah. What do you think, Bill?
Yeah, I think our the thing that we have, if we preserve it, is a trusted court system and the rule of law. We share that with most of the EU at this point. And so that's one of the reasons why the EU is often the toughest competitor for keeping top scientific talent. But people want, for themselves and for their children, to be in a place where you don't have secret court systems, you don't have the surveillance state, and so on. And that, I think, will be a long-term advantage.
And you can get patents.
You can get patents in other countries that we can think of, but they don't always mean much.
Well, not as good, not worth the paper they're on in some cases, I imagine. I guess it's hard for me to understand how this nation of immigrants, so proud of its innovative posture and the idea that the best and the brightest can come here and succeed, how we got to this position of turning them away. How did, that's a big question, but is there a relatively simple answer in your view, Bart?
Yes, you got to keep in mind that with a lot of these innovations and technologies, they put old jobs out of work. And so there are a lot of people in the country that feel like they were left behind. It's the elite, the wealthy, that are getting advantage of this. And my son lost his job because you have electric, cars now, and he used to work on carburetors. And then you combine that with a general economic downturn. And I think that was a lot of the problem. They thought that the benefits were inequitable.
Bill?
Yeah, well, I think this is a natural feature of the digital economy, that it has huge returns to scale. That drives monopolies, and the monopolies concentrate wealth in a small number of pockets. And so as more and more of the world gets digitalized, there will be more and more of this natural digital monopoly. That's being compounded by things like AI. The AI works best if you have access to the big data sets, and the big data sets are owned by the big incumbent companies. And so it makes it very hard for a startup, unless they have access to the giant data sets, to even get started in a high growth field like AI. And so we're going to have to rethink not only the future of work, but also the future of compensation. That if it's only tied, if your compensation is only tied to your ability to compete with a machine, it's not going to end well for a good slice of humanity. And that we have to actually look that beast in the eye and decide what we're going to do about it.
So let's talk a little bit about, we've talked about climate, we've talked a little bit about immigration. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about what legislative component might come into play when it comes to STEM education. You know, I think a lot of what we're seeing in this country at several levels, whether it's anti-vax, whether it's some of the misinformation campaigns, goes to a fundamental lack of understanding of the value of science, just even a basic understanding what the peer review process is, et cetera. We're failing young people, I think, in the way we teach them or don't teach them about science. You don't have to be a scientist to appreciate the value of science either. Take it from me, the history major. So Bart, how does that turn into a law? What do we, is it a matter of throwing money at the educational system? Education in this country is obviously a local thing, and it's difficult at a federal level to turn that aircraft carrier around. But do you have any ideas?
Miles, sort of like you, when I was first elected chairman of the science committee, a reporter asked me what was my area of science. And I told her political science. You know, I try to take the ideas of smart people like Bill and others and you know, put them into law.
We're frauds.
There's good and bad about this STEM. Probably there has been no area of education, in my opinion, where there's been a greater emphasis over the last 10 or 15 years than STEM education. When I was chairman of the committee, we passed a number of bills that provided incentives, particularly for minorities and for women, to bump that area up. I think our problem, well, there's two problems. Other countries also understand that and have done a better job. And a part of that is we haven't put enough emphasis on the teachers, on trying to get the good STEM teachers. You know, programs like Math for America in New York that Jim Simons put together really shows results. And so I think we're going to have to, again, it's more than just the students. We're going to have teachers that can inspire.
Yeah, there's also a big cultural benefit from having STEM education for everyone. That if, you know, in this pandemic, I was struck often that, for example, in Korea, you cannot get out of high school without knowing calculus. So the politicians there do not have to explain exponential growth or exponential decay because the students have all learned it in high school. Or a lot of the statistical uncertainties. You know, when they, oh, this vaccine came out and here are the number of cases of different kinds in the clinical trials. You know, people, unless they have a feeling for statistics, even from simple examples that they can get from doing simple experiments in high school, it's, you know, they want to know the answer, and they don't appreciate the fact that statistics are not all lies, and they contain information, and you have to understand the limits of the information in statistics. What was the Mark Twain thing about lies, damn lies, and statistics? Yeah. And nope, but statistics have information, and you have to understand the limits, and it's really a tough thing in politics, especially because people want to say, is this vaccine good or not? Instead of, well, here are all the numbers behind the clinical trial.
Yeah, well, listen, the journalistic profession is guilty as charged on that one for sure. So it really makes it difficult to do a story when you actually have to do nuance. Really, we don't have time for that. So I'm curious though, is it, you know, when you go back to your Sputnik analogy, I can't remember the amount of money. I think it was in 1957, I believe, Eisenhower pushed through and Congress pushed through up. I believe it was $900 million for education. I think that's coming out of my brain, but you guys could correct me, which, you know, in today's dollars is many billions. Is it a matter of earmarking, you know, a significant tranche of money for K-12 STEM education? And how would that look and how would that work nationwide? Bart, you want to start with that?
Well, as you know, the GAO did a report a few years ago I didn't agree with, but I have to go with Bill. I guess, you know, believe the science. they were saying that we had too many overlapping STEM programs. Personally, I think you need to meet the students where they are. You know, we had some in agriculture, we had some at NASA, we had some, you know, at different areas. So, and we had, again, minorities, women, women robotics, and those sorts of things. So there were, yes, there were a lot of different programs, but I didn't think they were really repetitious just because they were STEM oriented, because they were going for different individuals. Again, I would have to go back to that there is a lot of emphasis being placed on it, but we have to put more emphasis on, if you want to say funding, scholarships and rewards for those you know, students that want to become teachers. And we have to have a system, education system, where they're going to be respected.
Bill?
Yeah, I think respect is a huge part of it. You know, there's a sort of a self-image of the United States that, oh, we won World War II with a bunch of, you know, farm boys that knew how to repair Jeeps. All right. And they just kind of thought with their hands, and, you know, this whole thing, and that it wasn't really the science. And that changed a little bit at the end of the war, where people were, you know, understood that science was actually one of the keys to victory, along with radar. But this is, you know, this is a tough thing, and it's a reason why we have to maintain a bipartisan agreement to maintain science budgets and STEM education budgets, because, you know, it's a particularly tough thing in rural districts, because what happens is that if a kid does really well in STEM, they leave the small town they grew up in. Okay. And so they don't see, you know, they see STEM, they see even universities as something that steals the best and brightest every generation. And this is a tough, you know, this is a tough reality. And a lot of what appears to be anger at science, or anger at education, or anger at universities, I think is just sort of, you know, the heartbreak of seeing the small town that you grew up in fading away and dying for economic reasons, but it gets transferred to objections to science. And that's a tragic mistake when it happens.
That's a
Which
really...
goes back, if I could, Miles,
Yeah, go.
back to your earlier question, how do we get in this situation? You know, and a part of it is, it's again, those families in those small towns don't see an opportunity. I had an open meeting one time in a small town in my district, and I asked how many of the high school teachers, they were all high school seniors, how many were going to stay in their community once they graduated? Only one did. And I asked the others, well, why not? And they said that we'd like to be near our family and friends, but there are no opportunities here. And so, again, goes back to your earlier question, what's creating this rebellion against science and rebellion against the government? I'm afraid that's part of it.
Yeah. And one of the big things that's changed is the two-income families. That if you have, you know, very often, you know, the valedictorian of the small town high school class goes off to promises they're going to come back. Then they graduate, and they would come back, except they have a girlfriend who needs to have a career in her field of specialization, or, you know, you forgive the gender stereotyping, but if you get my point. And this is a change in the last 30 years. The two-income families makes it really hard to compete with the hubs of innovation that develop and amplify themselves.
Well, I got to say, I plead guilty to being a coastal elite, but that is such an interesting insight, that science is viewed in these communities not as an opportunity, but actually something that's a detriment. So here's a question for you. Look at where we all are now. We're all on Zoom. We've learned the way we're contextualized with geography is completely changing, and that's probably not going to go away once the pandemic is over. Is there an opportunity there to bring more opportunity to places where it might not exist by virtue of the fact that we're all learning to work in very different ways? Bart?
Well, Bill's going to have a chance to make a good shot at that here soon. I think you're going to see a very large infrastructure bill that's going to be passed that will be thought of as a stimulus. It'll have roads and bridges and things like that, but it's also going to have broadband to get to, you know, all across the country. And I think there is a bipartisan, you know, understanding, whether you're in a rural area or in a low income urban area, that we need to get broadband there. So I think is again, bipartisan. I'm very hopeful. And Bill, What do you think? Can y'all get that done?
Yeah, the bipartisan, well, yes, there's a lot of bipartisan interest in that. And it's amazing how rapidly it's going. There are going to be these constellations of satellites in low Earth orbit that will provide some kind of internet coverage everywhere on Earth, which will cause a little bit of grief for the autocracies, I hope. But it will. But that'll be important to rural America as well. Another thing that's amazing, a fact of economics, is that if you're a billionaire, you cannot buy a better smartphone than an ordinary person. It's just incredible. You can buy a better car, better house, better everything, but not a better smartphone. You can't buy a better Wikipedia. You have what it is. And a very good smartphone can be had for $100. And one of the lessons we've learned in COVID is that the benefits from telemedicine alone are a lot more than $100 per person. And so that I think we're going to see that this is going to be pushing on an open door, that it will be viewed as basically a human right in the United States to have a cell phone and a basic data plan. And that's going to open up all sorts of real opportunities to make government more efficient.
You guys opened up that smartphone, you'd find out all the research that went into it to be able to allow you to get it. So hopefully we want to have whatever the next good smartphone is, which means we have to invest in science and research.
So you guys have said a word I haven't heard in a while, a couple times now. It begins with a B. It's bipartisan. I'm going to dust that one off for a little while. And let's talk about the reality of that. As you look, Bill, you're right in the belly of the beast there. And I know it can be grim sometimes when you start trying to think in a bipartisan manner, given some of the rhetoric that's flying around. But surely these are the issues. If there are any issues we can come together on, these must be them, right? So what do you see as, from the prism of science and where you sit on your committee, what do you see as what are your top legislative priorities in your view?
Well, I think, both, President Biden, I think on the campaign trail, he sort of oscillated between doubling and tripling the science budget. All right. And I have already mentioned the Republican proposal, prior to COVID to double the budget. So I think we should say yes where we can really come to agreements. There are going to be areas where we are not going to come to agreements. And we just have to compartmentalize. That's very tough for some of the staff who have themselves or their friends been terrified for hours being trapped by a mob. And then, it's actually, I was fortunate that I was on my way in to vote when my chief of staff told me that it would be a very bad idea if I went to the Capitol right now. So I wasn't exposed to that terror, but there were staff members who were locked in rooms with the mob beating on the door for hours. And they find it very hard to work across the aisle with staff of members who think it's all should be just forgotten about. And so that's making bipartisanship a lot harder right now. And, we're just, I'm telling my staff to just compartmentalize, find the places where we can come to agreement and just see where our country wants to go.
It's hard to triangulate though, isn't it? Because you don't want to just say, oh, let's move on. That doesn't feel right either.
It is tough, but at least my staff, I'm telling them just compartmentalize because there are, if we miss the opportunity to make a big step forward in scientific research here, that will be a further damage from the mob.
All right, I want to sneak in a couple of questions here before I let them, before we run out of time. Here's one that would be for you, Bill. Angela Merkel is a physicist. Some say her physics training helps her to be a better leader. To our two physics-trained congressmen, how does your physics help you to be a better politician?
Oh boy. Well, I sometimes see my job here as trying to make this very irrational primate act slightly more rational by injecting an equal and opposite irrationality so it nets out rational. And it's, I obviously bring all of the charisma of the average physicist to this talk. And it's interesting. I think you have to just acknowledge your limitations. That if I try to behave like some stellar very talented politician, it doesn't work. And so I've learned not to even try. And that you find you can take advantage then of the trust in science that still remains at a very deep level in the American public. And they'll tolerate you going wonky for a while. In fact, as long as you end your wonkiness with the conclusion that they understand. And so it's that's the art that, you know, and there's also a very large set of neurons that you have to deaden to convert a physicist's brain into a politician's. And so I'm suffering from that as well.
Let me give you another example.
Embrace the wonk, but not too much. Go ahead, Bart.
Another example of that is how at least scientists will follow the science. We had a wonderful fellow, and he was a physicist named Roscoe Bartlett, from Maryland. He was on the science committee, and there was somebody testifying, a Republican there, talking about, you know, how climate change was crazy or this or that. And so finally, Roscoe just had enough, and he says, "I am a conservative Republican, but I'm not an idiot." And that sort of shut all that down. You know, you can be conservative and not be an idiot. And that's what, obviously you can, but I mean, physicists of both parties and scientists of both parties will follow the facts much better.
Let's hope. Let's hope for that.
And that's what was so discouraging about the whole mask debate. You know, where the science was clear, people were dying, that's when science should have kicked in, and somehow emotion overrode it.
What can we do to get more scientists involved in the legislative process? Bill, since you've done it, and I'm sure you talked to a lot of people about this, it'd be nice to have a few more people with a technical background who are making laws.
Sure. Well, there are many. First off, it doesn't have to be an elected office. There's a tremendous benefit to having a really competent federal bureaucracy here. You know, if you ask yourself who's probably had the most influence in, say, the science effort at the Department of Energy over the last 20 years, it was no one elected. It was Pat Damer, who just worked at a sort of right below the political level, was extremely competent. And she had, I think, left a career at one of the laboratories and worked in the federal bureaucracy, and was really a positive force to make sure that when Congress came up with these bright ideas, they were translated into workable programs. And there's no substitute for really competent, you know, scientists there. Secondly, there's a benefit in elected office to have scientists at all altitudes. It's not us, oh, I'm going to wake up one day and run for Congress, though that's kind of what I did. There's a huge benefit of having a scientific competence on your school boards, on your city councils. And it's also a good stepping stone. When I'm on the recruiting committee for the Democratic Party, and one of the most valuable recruits you can get is a very popular local mayor. And so that's a way that you can get started in this. You run for school board, city council, run for mayor. And then that allows you to sidestep the whole business with campaign finance, which is the biggest barrier to entry and one of the ugliest realities about our political system right now.
So Bart, give you an awful statistics. I read the other day where 1,000 scientists left the government over the last 4 years. So there certainly are a lot of opportunities. And I would challenge some of the associations to try to find ways to fund sabbaticals so that scientists like AAAS and others could find a way into congressional offices or other places to provide their expertise.
And it's also there's very good programs where you rotate in for a year or two. Those are valuable, but what you really want to do is have a career pathway so you can spend a decade in the federal government. And so what we need out of the universities is to have some tenured chairs reserved for people who spent 10 years in the federal bureaucracy. And that would, and then can return and do real research again. Because the people you want are the 40-some-year-olds, and you're asking them to take 10 years out of the heart of their productive career to increase the efficiency of the federal science operation. And so we have to think how that path and all the conflicts of interest and stuff when you try to design the programs. and to make that actually work better.
So what Bill was saying is we're putting this on APS and other organizations and universities to try to find a way to integrate their best and brightest into the government.
All right, so Bart, though, a couple of words about us humanities guys here. Do we need more, scientists who can embrace the inner wonk, or humanities guys like you who aren't afraid of the subject and want to understand it from coming at it from the right brain, or is it a question of neither or? Excuse me, just doing both?
No, it's a combination. I had an amendment to the NSF budget several years ago that said that for scientists to get a grant, they had to speak English. It was tongue in cheek. When I said English, it wasn't the English language, that they had to be able to explain to the public what they were getting the money for and what they were going to try to do. And I think, again, internally, we need to do a better job of helping scientists to speak, people, so that they can explain what they're doing.
Yeah, and social scientists usually have a pretty good grasp of statistics. And that's one of the things where we really have to do a better job of communicating with the public, communicating scientific uncertainty without making it sound like we don't know what we're talking about. And that's the hardest thing that I've found. Speaking, you have to simplify the scientific arguments without losing the scientific correctness of what you've said by oversimplification. That's my continual struggle.
It's so interesting to me as a journalist to read a scientific paper in a journal, and the entire paper is all about the things that probably would make it not true. And then you get to the conclusion line, then that's where the degree of certainty is. It's like you're burying the lead here, people. So it's important. I firmly believe that scientists who can communicate really must. The stakes are way too high. Those that can't or are just uncomfortable, it's fine. Just stay in the lab and do your thing. But it's really important, I think. I'm sure you guys would agree on this. Let me just ask you before we get away on what your general sense. I mean, listen, we're in the middle of this historic pandemic. The climate emergency grows worse by the day. We've had an onslaught against scientists. You just mentioned the numbers that were leaving the federal government over the past 4 years. And yet you're talking now about a Sputnik moment. Would you classify yourself as optimistic about where the scientific enterprise is headed right now? And you start, Bill.
Well, you can view it as whether we're going to be doing a better job in science. And I think the answer is yes. I'm very confident that we're going to do that. However, the rest of the world, we're 5% of the world. That means that 95% of the geniuses are in different countries. We can't expect that our fractional dominance will remain as high as it's been historically. We got very lucky to get an early start on the rest of the world in many areas. But so that I think the best thing that we can hope for is that the way we approach science, our scientific method, our openness, our willingness to share the economic benefits with the rest of the world instead of hoarding them to ourselves, that will be emulated by the rest of the world as they inevitably catch up with us because they have more people than we do.
Bart?
Well, I'm optimistic for some of the reasons that we talked about earlier. I think the pandemic puts a face on the benefits for science, and we can talk about, the other problems and future problems that can be solved there. We also have a president and administration now that's going to, I think, lead by example. They're going to make science a part of their decisions, and they're going to prioritize funding. So I think we're at an important point right now, and continue to push, and we'll be successful.
Sure hope that's the way it all plays out. And it's good to end on an optimistic note like that. Bart Gordon, Bill Foster, thank you for your time. Thank you for your service over the years to our country, and keep slugging away there and advocating for these things that we hold so dear. We really appreciate you sharing your insights with us today. The APS audience really appreciates it.
Thanks, Miles.
I'm Miles O'Brien. We are going to take a brief 5-minute break. We're going to reset the deck, change the Brady Bunch squares a little bit, and have another group of panelists to take this to more of a global perspective. So go take a break, make yourself a cup of coffee, or if it's cocktail hour, do whatever you got to do. Spend 5 minutes with yourself and come back and join us. And thank you very much for all your time so far. Welcome back to part 2 of our excellent panel on science and public policy, international affairs, and how scientists can be a part of a changed political dialogue in this country, and that how that is viewed by other countries and how we can relate to them as we march forward. Continuing our discussion, we have a very esteemed panel. Joining us from the United Kingdom is Sir Peter Knight of the Imperial College of London, a physicist and a professor of quantum optics. Neal Lane of Rice University, who is a former OSTP director and advisor to President Clinton, former NSF director. And here we go, Sethuraman Panchanathan, but we're going to call him Panch. I think I did it. And I'm so pleased. That's the one thing I've been losing sleep over. Panch, we're going to go with henceforth. Good to see you. And finally, Ellen Williams of the University of Maryland, who researches in surface properties and nanotechnology, formerly the chief scientist of BP and headed ARPA-E. Good to have you all with us. I think I do want to start off with this idea that we began with on the previous panel, and that is this sense of whether this is some kind of inflection moment. A Sputnik moment was the term that the members of Congress used in the last session. Ellen, I'm going to begin with you. Is this an inflection point akin to a Sputnik moment in your view?
Absolutely. I believe this is a Sputnik moment in particular for science in general, but in particular right now, we're just facing 2 simultaneous existential crises. One is this pandemic, which I think we have to assume is not an isolated incident, but something that we're going to have to work on and about forever. And the other is climate change. And both of those issues have science at their core. And they also have the very obvious aspect of its science very carefully linked to the social structure, the economic structure, to commercialization and manufacturing. So it's a perfect inflection point in which we can decide how to move forward, but we have to do it in a way that brings all of society with us to understand that we can deliver the goods.
Panch, there is that expression, never waste a good crisis. And I think that's what Ellen is implying there, that out of these dire times, that's where big things can happen. Would you go along with that?
Oh, absolutely, Miles. And thanks, Ellen, for presenting that. I would also add to this, this is a moment, and you talked about it in the previous panel very nicely, Miles, with the panelists. This is a moment that we have tremendous competition globally. And so this moment of competition, I always talk about competition brings the best in us. It challenges us, motivates us to do even better than we've ever done before. So that's the other defining moment, if you want to add that. And then there's one more thing I will also talk about, which is there is tremendous talent across our nation. I call them the missing millions across the socioeconomic demographic and the geographical diversity of our nation. So this domestic talent has to be brought out in full force, full scale, along with the global talent being attracted in full force and full scale. So this is a moment that we have the opportunity to do that. And this was sort of talked about in the previous panel too, and I'm just drawing that out. And finally, the bipartisan thing that was talked about in the previous panel. For science, and that science can ensure prosperity of our nation and the well-being is something that's coming out very clearly, if not ever before. And therefore, these moments, these points then make this moment very powerful in terms of science and what it can do for society, humanity, and economy. So I think it's very, very important moment, absolutely.
Neal, your background as the OSTP director, you weren't at the cabinet level then. It's an important move, I think, probably. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But generally speaking, do you think that is more than a symbolic move and representative of kind of a new sheriff in town when it comes to science?
Well, of course, I was delighted to hear President Biden's appointment, first of all, of Eric Lander and all the other extraordinary members of the science team. I think the elevation to the cabinet is significant, both symbolically, but also in substance. I mean, of course, I was invited to all the cabinet meetings with other senior aides and had a chance to observe, I would say, and benefit from being there. And then, of course, you catch the cabinet secretaries afterwards, or they catch you because they need something. So that was fine. That was important. And John Holdren, more recently has talked about his role, that he had no trouble getting access to the president. I think that was clear. John had a very good relationship, close relationship with President Biden. I could always see President Clinton when I needed to. But there is something qualitatively special about sitting on the cabinet, sitting at the table, being engaged with the heads of the administration, the president, vice president, the cabinet secretaries, and the other men and women who Biden will choose to be on the cabinet. So it is different. And I think it implies, symbolically, it implies science really is going to be a major priority of this administration, as President Biden has said. But it also means that OSTP, I think, is elevated in terms of what it can do, working with the other offices in the White House and the agencies to help the president, give the president advice, but also help coordinate the agencies when necessary. So I think it's very significant. I'm delighted to see it's been recommended by many of us for a while. It has pros and cons, but right now, I think, given all that's happened in the last 4 years, and of course, most recently, the pandemic, it's clear the time has come.
Just out of curiosity, what are the cons?
I'm sorry?
What are the cons? You said it has pros and cons. Yeah.
As we've talked about these things over the decades, if you like, the worry was that science would be politicized. Well, I would say it's a little late.
I think that horse is a little out of the barn.
Yeah,
stampeding away.
I understand the argument, and it's not silly argument, because the cabinet, by and large, is a much more political body. And the people who sit at the cabinet secretaries are often involved in helping the president get out to the public on behalf of not just the administration, but the party. I believe that this is going to work fine with the relationship that Eric Lander and President Biden have.
Excellent. Well, and we should remind our audience that we're looking for your questions and thoughts all throughout this. So if something comes to mind, they will get that to me, and I'll try to inject it as best I can. Sir Peter, what is your view from across the pond? Do you see a Sputnik moment from where you sit?
I do. And I think that it really is an existential moment, as everybody else has said. And I think what it's enabled us to do is to realize that in a crisis, you see an incredible acceleration of innovation, of really dramatic things happening very quickly, because we are in an existential moment. So we see it around the world, in fact, in terms of the speed of response, the bringing together of people from different disciplines to actually address really complex problems that are existential. So yeah, we see it everywhere, in the UK just as much as in the US.
We have a question that just came in, which gets us right into the area we wanted to get in, so I'm going to read it right now. China is an increasingly large threat to our security, meaning the U.S. in this case. They advance science for many dual-use purposes for the express intention of aggression against the U.S. How do we defend our science against this challenge, especially when an adversary may not necessarily operate in good faith? Well, we went right to the core of the issue, didn't we? I'll tell you what, since I started with Ellen, I'm going to circle back to you. You want to take that hot potato?
Well, it really is a hot potato. I would say that I think we need to be very careful and separate out the community of basic research scientists across the world, including in China, who interact in good faith and work with one another, collaborate with one another, and have been, I have had phenomenal Chinese colleagues over the years from the real issues of national security that we know we face at a military and intelligence level.
So Panch, that's a easier said than done, isn't it? It's difficult to know what the full intentions might be and what those partnerships might in fact lead to, right?
So I think, the key here is it's a balance, right? I mean, if you look at fundamental research has always been open, and it should be transparent so we can share. And science is global. So we need to work as a global community, solving global grand challenge problems as well as global problems. Science is global. And so you work together, and there's a lot of things that happen at the investigator to investigator level, student investigator level. There's a lot of those partnerships that happen. So the important thing, Miles, I find is when you have a partnership, you have some basic agreements, right? I mean, you share values, you share aspirations. Of course, openness, transparency is all important. At the same time, you develop mutual trust in a partnership, right? And you have reciprocity in a partnership. And you have respect for research integrity in the partnership. So you want to find like-minded partners. And there are many, many across the globe, like-minded partners who share all of these values that we stand for when we talk about science and collaborations with science. And therefore, when we start to work with those partners, you can build amazing things for the future. And that's the exciting part. So that's one side of it. But there is always a challenge on the other side. I mean, what happens when there is not that shared reciprocity, or when there are challenges in terms of not having research integrity that we, hold, to. And so in that case, and then we have to have protections and mechanisms by which you're able to safeguard those things that needs to be safeguarded. And typically fundamental basic research does not usually have those areas that you have. Many of them don't have those challenges. And so you need to work to make sure that we are not treating everything the same, that you are looking at science at large and seeing where there are opportunities to continue to advance in the manner that promotes the progress of science for global good and national good. And at the same time, you want to safeguard those things that needs to be safeguarded. And I would say that there are mechanisms today that allow you to safeguard those. It's just that we have to make sure that we properly do that, systematize that, institutionalize that, and take appropriate precautions. And if you do that, I think we will make rapid advances, as well as ensure that we are not completely closing down, not being totally open without the awareness of what these challenges are. So I think it's a balance, as I started talking about it in the beginning.
So Neal, of course, the concern is that the pendulum swings too far in one direction or the other. I think the point is well taken. We're talking about huge existential planet-wide threats here, and an international response to it is, of course, appropriate, if not necessary. So, but then there are concerns about intellectual property and how things can be taken, appropriated, misused, or whatever. So what is there? There's no easy way to sort through all this, but is there a way to think about policy that honors that international nature of science and yet protects what we hold dear?
Well, first of all, I agree with the comments my colleagues just made, which doesn't surprise me, of course. Let me say a couple of things. First, the political attacks on individuals, Chinese scientists and other rhetoric, anti-Chinese rhetoric, reprehensible. It's just un-American to an extraordinary degree that we really haven't seen in a long time. So they need to be called out on that. The second thing, I think, for all of us is to always keep in mind that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, is not the same as all Chinese people, wherever they're living. And I think often this gets lost. In terms of policy, of course, Congressman Bill Foster just said he just gave an example of in his days working at Fermilab, which he probably looked back fondly on. There was cooperation between Russian scientists and the United States. And in the Reagan administration, the National Security Decision Directive very much recognized the difference between fundamental and basic research and other kinds of research and development activities. So we've had the right thinking about this for a very long time. But since the China issue has become totally politicized, then things get said and policies get put in place, say by the previous administration, that may be surprising to many of us. Certainly, I'm surprised how far the pendulum swung in those particular cases. I think in terms of policy, look at the Jason report that NSF had done. I mean, a very balanced report about clarification of the rules and as I recall, and I don't remember the details, but getting the same thing, I think, was picked up by the J-Corps activity that Kelvin Drogemeyer, a member of the previous administration, who was trying to address in an appropriate way all the things we're talking about. I think those reports and those guidelines express this balance, trying to make this distinction and ensuring that bad laws don't get passed and that bad policies don't get in place that are harmful, not just to individuals, but to the United States during a time, as you said, Miles, when so many of these challenges, first of all, science has been international. That's how the US makes progress. That's how other countries make progress, but also at a time when there are these large existential threats that are global in nature, and we're not going to be able to deal with if we're not cooperating in science.
Peter, from where you sit, do you have the sense that American science is too open? And is it time to rethink that open nature, or would that be too injurious to research?
I'm sure it would be injurious to basic research. Basic research is truly global. The best scientists in the world are not constrained by geography. They want to work with the best wherever. Talent is really what it's all about. And so I don't think you can constrain fundamental science within national borders. I think that I share many of the views already expressed by the panel that one wants to work out ways in which one has shared ethical values, trust, and so on. That must be an important element of it. For fundamental science, openness is the way that we actually work together in so many things. I do worry about some of the rhetoric. Is it a bad thing that China is so strongly investing in science? Well, no, it's not, in my view. It's pulled many millions out of abject poverty through that investment. And you've got to remember that investing in science is what all developed nations have done in order to give a better quality of life for their citizens. So I think all of these things are important to remember. Fundamental science crosses boundaries everywhere. If you look at the very best scientific papers that are published, they often share international collaboration and co-authorship. And that's something that we treasure. Geography means very little to the very best scientists if they're working on basic science. Nevertheless, there are things that we need to put in place in order to protect things like intellectual property, to protect the sense of integrity and trust in the way that we engage with each other. And I absolutely share what Neal just said about the need to avoid the vilification of individuals. This is pernicious.
Indeed. Ellen, I'm curious from your perspective. I've read some of these proposals that are out there, which would essentially allow government bureaucrats to sort of decide what's sensitive, what's not, what can be shared, what can't. I imagine from a university perspective, that would have a huge chilling effect on your ability to do your work.
Certainly, just the bureaucratic overhead of dealing with such a system is going to be a huge drag and slow down on anything that we can accomplish technically. So even if the system was designed in a fairly benign fashion in terms of intent, the fact that you're laying on this extra, almost unneeded layer of bureaucracy is going to be a big problem. At the very least, I think you would like to have a well-informed scientific advisory group reviewing those policies and making sure that the load is kept as light as possible so as not to draw down our advances in basic research.
Yeah, Panch, I know that there's a proposal out there, one I saw, that would sort of create a working group of scientists that would get in the middle of this process. Do you think is that a workable solution potentially?
So I think, at the end of the day, you want to make it such that, make all of these work such that the scientists are, as Ellen was referring to, it doesn't become an extreme burden on the scientists themselves. And, there's a certain amount of responsibility, having come from an institution where I was responsible for, as an officer of the institution, putting making sure that things are working. I mean, for example, conflict of interest or conflict of commitment. These are kinds of things that if you put the proper processes in place, and if the academic institutions, ensure that people are able to declare them, and they're voluntarily declaring all of the things that they already are engaged in, I think we can have a very healthy system emerging out of that. So having a group of scientists who are able to think through this, who think through those things that can be done, because the problem is something that everybody sees. It's not that the people don't see the problem. It's to find the right solutions that is workable from an individual scientist perspective, from the institution's perspective, from the agency perspective, and from the federal perspective. So I think all of these inputs are exceedingly important. Neal touched upon this Jason report, and I think that nicely outlined that. And to my earlier point and the point of others about the balance, it talked about this balance, about the fundamental research, and then there are the areas of research where we think that we need to have protections, and we clearly have this what's called classified and unclassified as two different versions of how you look at advancing on those technologies that we think are proprietary, and we need to make sure that we're able to advance them without any of these challenges that we face. So I think putting proper processes in place for individual scientists to declare their conflict of interest or their conflict of commitment, and then institutions being able to manage that, and agencies in the federal bureaucracy then having the larger processes that we talked about with this open mind in terms of these two different situations that we talked about and achieving the right balance is, I would say, Miles, I think that as I said earlier, I think things are in place. It's to systematize them, institutionalize them, raise awareness. Oftentimes, I tell you, training, education, awareness is even more important because people don't do this, contrary to the thinking out there. It is not that people willfully engaged in some of these things. Many of them might have done something unknowingly. So more education, more training, more awareness. These are all good things that needs to be thought of as part of the package that I talked about of how you move forward. So to answer your question very precisely, I think it's always good to have groups of people providing input to a process so that it can be made to work better for everyone.
Here's a question for the audience. There are threats to security, but the China initiative is devastating innocent Chinese American scientists and their families. The old DOJ bragged about chasing these valuable scientists out of the USA. What to do? Neal, you want to try that?
Well, I think I agree with with the sentiments of the questioner. It was extraordinary to pick out a single country, and I think it just reflects the politicization of this issue. So yeah, let's go a different direction, and I believe we will be going in a different direction in the Biden-Harris administration. But it also gives me a chance to say that one of the reasons, or I should say, the activities that gave ammunition to those people who maybe are anti-China anyway, was some bad behavior on the part of the Chinese central government. So then it becomes difficult for people, even in the Congress and maybe in the previous administration, who want to argue the issues, the balance, the issues we're talking about. They're up against then the central government of China doing something that just inflames people's views. And I think part of the problem, these cases that we've read about, some of which are serious, but they're, as far as I can tell, many of the more serious issues are with companies where intellectual property has been leaked back to China rather than from universities. But in some of these cases, and they're quite tragic, the criminalization of activity really reflects in part the lack of understanding of what research is all about and how research is done in universities and what international cooperation really means when it comes to fundamental science. And then it also sometimes reflects the fact that the rules maybe weren't as clear as they might be by the agencies and by the universities, or had not been enforced. And so people became less serious about their response. And then the third thing, I think back to the point Peter made, that when people have not been in the United States very long, they may not appreciate how our law works, what the regulations mean, how seriously we take regulations and rules and laws, and even our ethical practices. So back to you, Panch. I'm thinking education, training. I mean, making sure as quickly as possible, as soon as possible, when people come into our country, that they do understand those things, so they don't just inadvertently fall into traps.
How real is this problem? How much of it is fear and jingoism, and how much of it is real? It's very difficult on the outside of the scientific enterprise, particularly when you're talking about sensitive areas, which we may or may not be privy to. Is this problem overblown, or is it a bigger problem than we think? And Neal, you want to stay with that one?
Well, it's not hard to find a few examples, but the numbers are not large. Right. And you say it's hard to tell from outside the scientific enterprise. Let me say it's kind of hard to tell from inside the scientific enterprise. And I guess maybe I'm more outside than I am in these days. I'd already said before, I think some of the most serious events, misbehavior, occurred with companies rather than universities. So I think there's been an overreaction, is my view, because of the political element. But we do need to understand more. And in terms of policy, what I'd like to see, and I think maybe the Jason report pointed to this, but Punch can correct me if I'm wrong, is to get the decisions back closer to the universities where the faculty are. Be sure they have the mechanisms in place to ensure that their faculty, especially those who taking research money from the federal government, are following the rules, and rather than criminalizing everything, which has been a more recent trend.
This is a question, Sir Peter, we'll send this over to you, and then maybe Panch wants to weigh in as well, and all of you can on this one. This comes from the audience. The need of training international researchers and research managers are crucial in the global collaboration. What's the best way to encourage and establish a good relationship between researchers and research administrators and institutions? Peter?
Oh, that's a very good question. One of the problems that we need to do is to make sure that the active scientists really get engaged in these sort of processes, so that it's not left to people who are just putting structures together. I just wanted to come back to what we were just saying. One of the things that we are working really quite hard on back in the UK is a program called Responsible Research and Innovation, which is looking at the threat space, what it is that one needs to do in terms of being responsible, ethical, and the way one behaves. So the RRI program is being rolled out right across the entire research enterprise in the UK. And it's being done by engaging rather than being peremptory and instructing. And I think that's really quite important in this. As to the pervasiveness of the threat space, by the way, I think we do see very substantial evidence of penetration attempts on IP, principally from companies, and it's not trivial on these things. So the RRI program is intended to do that. One thing that we are seeing, though, is an attempt to try to categorize in a kind of enormous catalog of sensitive areas things that one needs to protect. Through what's going through Parliament at the moment in the UK is a National Security Investment Bill, which is generating a gigantic catalogue of what they regard as sensitive areas. And so we have worked really, really hard to brigade scientists to advise on the sensitivity and the appropriateness of a catalogue. I think this is quite important. So working with our if you like, research administrators so that scientists can see and make an input to that structure has been really quite important for us.
I know in this country, it sounds very similar to your catalog. There has been talk of a risk matrix for technologies that I believe that's being done at DOE or is done at DOE. You guys would know better on this. In other words, which would sort of try to define what are the things you have to be more sensitive to. I mean, Ellen, do you have some thoughts on whether that's a good idea, something like that approach?
It's really hard to do a risk matrix. You need to kind of balance the possible effect that could happen against the probability that it happens. And especially with early stage research, we don't know many times exactly what the outcomes are going to be. And we certainly don't know the probability that we're going to get there. So it's a hard problem, and it's one which easily could wind up crippling a nascent technology. I think an area where we could see some real damage done would be quantum computing. It's still early days to make quantum computing into a really working, powerful technology. And if we start locking down research and international discussion on what's going on in that field, we could easily throttle the US's ability to advance while other countries move forward rapidly.
Well, Peter, that's your realm. So why don't you pick up on that?
I can only agree with Ellen that in terms of emerging technologies, it's very easy to strangle these nascent areas that are really going to emerge. And I think there have been some really useful and sensible discussions, for example, in the quantum computing space, with people around the world who are pioneering these things, sharing their concerns and worrying about the inappropriateness of premature boundaries, if you like, about what's ethical. I want to come back to this business about a risk register. One of the things that I've had to do for more than a decade now, along with others, is we have a thing called the National Risk Register. And the National Risk Register has impact on one axis and likelihood on the other.
Yep.
And right at the top, and I've been peer reviewing this for some time, and right at the top in terms of impact and likelihood, of course, is pandemics. Okay, so it's really good to have these things, and we scrutinize the assumptions, and we work really hard with a lot of other government science advisors. What is needed, of course, and it's often lacking, is an investment strategy that's long-term in terms of infrastructure necessary to provide resilience against what's identified in that risk register. So closing the circle so that you actually understand that you have to invest in order to combat the most likely impactful things on the risk register is really important. And the only way you can really do that, I think, is to bring the actors together, the people that run the research funding organizations, an industry voice, and so on. That's what we've been trying to do. We had a kind of transformation in the UK program. It was actually very much propelled by Paul Nurse when he was president of the Royal Society, producing a report called Science at the Heart of Government. And we keep stressing to Paul that we wanted to avoid, wherever possible, government at the heart of science.
Science should be at the heart of government, probably.
Absolutely.
Punch, do you think there should be some mechanism or means, or is it even possible to imagine putting, export controls on basic fundamental research? Does that make any sense at all?
See, the thing is, I mean, we talked about this, we touched upon this, I think the panelists have shared this view. I mean, here's the thing, Miles. Let's take AI today. Let's take concrete examples, okay? Let's take AI today. AI today did not magically appear. It's 5 decades of investment in basic research that was made across the globe, predominantly in the United States, large share of it being from the National Science Foundation. Even today, non-defense spending, 60 to 70% of that is NSF funding in terms of advancing the AI research. So here we are today. AI is a very important outcome of that decades of research investments in terms of tangible things that happens with AI. Now, clearly, that is being spearheaded by industry, and industry has mechanism of how to safeguard their intellectual property, safeguard their secrets and things of that nature. And even in academia, you have mechanisms of actually, declaring your inventions, intellectual property, etc., copyright, etc. So all of these mechanisms exist today. So one has to be careful. And so to the point that Ellen made and Peter made, which I agree with, is quantum is in its earlier stages compared to AI. And so there is more investment that needs to be happening. And then collective investments by all the countries. For example, I was talking yesterday to the chief science advisor from Canada, Mona Niebuhr. Now, Canada invests $1 billion in quantum. Would you want to collaborate with them? I talked to Dame Orlean from UKRI. They're investing heavily in quantum. Should we be talking to them? Absolutely. And so how might we get the collective investments, collective intellect, collective ideas everywhere, collective talent, all working together so that we might achieve the futures that we are aspiring for, like what is an AI today, with the caveat that as things get developed, industry and academia have the mechanisms to be able to protect intellectual property and to be able to safeguard those things that need to be safeguarded. And we talk about classified versus unclassified, so you can have those mechanisms of ensuring that we're protecting those things that need to be protected. Now, you asked a question earlier, and if I can take a moment to respond to that. You said, how might we have this international sensitization of people, administrators and things of that nature in terms to build collaborative research infrastructure? I cannot agree with you more in terms of welcoming international scientists, talent, ideas, students, the exchanges happening in multilateral ways. This is what makes science really exciting, makes science really great, and what happens because of science. So that should always be at the forefront of our thinking. How do we have these kinds of exchanges? And now, Miles, you talked about this a little while earlier in the previous panel. We have this, a Brady Bunch kind of a setup right now, which makes it even more easier. For example, the day before yesterday morning, I had the chief science advisors call across all the nations. I was at 6 a.m. here, and we have folks in Australia and New Zealand, late night there, and then across the entire spectrum of people participating in this. It is possible to have conversations like this between scientists, between administrators. Therefore, it is even more possible today to do things that probably was not even thought of as seamless a couple of years ago. So I think it's an exceedingly important thing for us to move that way. I can assure you that NSF is doing everything to ensure that our global collaborations are rich, are enabled. This idea of global exchange of ideas and talent is catalyzed to the maximum extent possible, because that's what is going to guarantee in the United States that we're going to have a robust scientific enterprise, robust ideas, robust talent. And with one last thing, if I can plug in, when we talk about these things, the real issue here is the funding for science and engineering and technology in the United States. If it is at a much higher level, some of these problems will naturally disappear too. Let's not forget that. Let's not forget the fact that the funding is an essential part. The investment in science, investment in scientific ideas, investment in grooming scientific talent is exceedingly important to ensure some of the challenges you're talking about, disappears, in fact, when you talk about the investment being at the right size. And so I would encourage us as a nation to think about how we might invest more so that some of these problems can be addressed also naturally, in addition to the other things that I talked about. Thank you.
Well, Panch has successfully reminded me of the old reporter's maxim, always follow the money. So Neal, is this a problem that money can address in the way he suggests? And it seems to me when you hear about these proposals about putting fundamental basic research on an export control list, that is a proposal that somebody who really doesn't understand how science works is trying to putting a Band-Aid on a problem they perceive. But is this at its core a funding issue?
Well, it's money's not everything, they said, but it's a lot, and so we do have to pay attention to it. But first, let me something that occurred to me as I guess Ellen and others were talking. I sometimes just wonder what Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Bohr, Einstein might think about how quantum has suddenly become an issue of national security and risk and so forth. We're not going to know, but it would be interesting to pose. The United States, I think one of the contextual issues about all that we're talking about, including the point Panch just made about the science and engineering workforce and young people, education and interest in science, is that we are still living on the investments that were made, some of them from the Second World War, some of them from the Apollo program, so that integrated circuit, the transistor, and the laser, that came shortly after the end of the Second World War and was the result of those wartime needs. And then advanced electronics that came out of that fueled the laptops that came along in the 80s, high performance computing, in that time, the internet, the World Wide Web that came out of high energy physics, the internet that came out of DARPA's contributions and their partnership with the NSF to make the protocol and the net available to the larger public. And then on today, I mean, CRISPR technology and LIGO's observation of collision of black holes and so many other things have come. They've evolved over a long period of time in which the federal government invested, especially several decades ago, considerable amount of funding in research and development. There was almost a 20-year period, even after Apollo, between say 1975 and 1993, when the United States federal government was growing its investment in basic research in real terms by over 4%. And then suddenly the bottom fell out in the 90s. I won't be political, but around 93, 94, 94 and 95. And then it's been rippling, down, up a little bit, down again. Agencies can't plan that way. You can't effectively invest R&D money that way. So there are a couple of issues. How much money? More. We need to think about this investment as a fraction of the global domestic product. We need to think about how it drives the economy through private sector innovation downstream. But nonetheless, without this front end of basic research investment, discovery and invention, and then all the work of scientists and engineers, and then the private sector, there's not going to be anything to innovate. I mean, while other countries are moving far ahead, China's been mentioned. Of course, China is a significant, the rapid rise of China, a significant reason why it's time for the United States to finally pay attention, not be less complacent, avoid the perils that await us if we don't pay more attention to science and engineering.
So, Ellen, it sounds like what Neal is saying there is just kind of buttresses that initial idea which we began with, that this is this kind of Sputnik moment. The crises are big. The demand is great for answers, and maybe it is time to get past this idea that science is. I don't know. We could go back to Proxmire and the Golden Fleece and all the way science was looked askance in the federal budget, but it really isn't an expenditure. It is an investment, and if you ever really did the math on it, I'm sure somebody has. We get a lot more out of it than we put in. So, if you were, would this be a good time to be back at ARPA-E and thinking about ways to change the way we move our economy and make it greener? Do you think this is a time where the money will be there?
I sincerely hope so, and it looks like it. ARPA-E has actually been doing surprisingly well, even over the past 4 years, primarily because of bipartisan congressional support. I would say that kind of the ARPA-E mentality is we have in the United States a huge basis of fundamental research, and at any given time, some small fraction of that is ready to bloom and create something amazing and new that can be turned into a product. And the job of an agency like ARPA-E is to find those blossoms and help them grow and help them get on a pathway to commercialization. And everything that, especially that Neal was just saying, was making me think about the very close connection I see between the health of science and the health of a related national commercial and industrial base. Science does better in an environment where there is application and where there's an infrastructure of industrial knowledge and need. And industry and commercialization does better when there is a strong basis of fundamental research. And we need both those things working together. And I think one of the things that has been scary about some of the rapidly developing countries is that they have been able to pull with a lot of opportunities to move things into commercialization. And people who have good ideas and can't make the move in the United States will hop. So I would love to be at ARPA-E. I enjoyed it when I was there before, and I'm going to look forward with really great pleasure to seeing how they advance. And I also was really interested in the proposals about doing something similar within NSF in terms of really setting up some pathways to make that leap from the basic ideas to the prototype demonstration that we have a possibility to move forward on a pathway to commercialization.
I guess the question is the openness worth the risk? I mean, that's the balance, right? Sir Peter, do you think being open about science has great potential benefit if people are addressing big problems globally, but inherent in that is a risk that somebody's going to steal your idea. So at the bottom of the ledger, what do you see?
I think that openness in fundamental science is natural, it's part of the way we do everything. It's really important to remember the impact of openness of borders to great scientific talent migrating to and fro is an element of soft power. People who come to the United States, sometimes only temporarily, and then return home, have learnt how to do things responsibly, efficiently, and with momentum. And they come back from the United States remembering that lesson and emulating it back in their own country. I should declare that my first ever paid job after my PhD was to go to the United States. I learned a great deal. I came back to the UK and thought, this is a different way of doing things. So soft power, the importance of the way that the United States is viewed around the world, could actually be enhanced by that transparency and openness of those kind of borders. You're quite right that one needs to be really, really careful about these emergent technology areas that really have an impact on one's national sovereignty, if you like. But that balance is easy to accomplish by having the right scientific friends involved in that enterprise to guide government about what might be emerging. But do remember, soft power is really important. People regard the United States as an exemplar. They come, learn, come back, replicate, but they share share common values with what they've learned in the United States. You know, the years that I spent in the US were transformative for me and for many others around the world.
Panch, have we come to overlook the value of that soft power? I mean, what comes to mind when I think of soft power, I think of the success of NASA, what NASA has done in the space program in particular, as an instrument of the United States and the American way and the value of science, et cetera. Is this something that the scientific enterprise needs to educate our own political leadership a little bit more about and its value?
Miles, that's an excellent point. I've been talking about this quite a bit. I think if there is a lack of understanding, let's take some ownership of that and see how we might educate and sort of talk about these things much more openly with all audiences, with the public, with the legislative body, with others, and not think that people have to understand just because it is so, but see how we might educate through examples, exemplars. So the soft power, I cannot agree with Sir Peter Knight more. Absolutely, I call them science ambassadors. When people come here, we want them to stay and prosper. And I was one of those. And I'm so grateful to this country for having given me this opportunity. I think this is the land of opportunity, meritocracy, and a whole lot of things. And so I just cherish this every day of my life. But then there are some, like Sir Peter Knight, who go back and then they carry those values. Those are science ambassadors, and we need them because that's what is going to make the scientific community, the robust, value-based community that we were talking about earlier, that we are aspiring to. So it's a work in progress. It'll always be a work in progress. It'll never be the perfect thing, but we should always aspire to do that. So that's one thing that I want to make sure that we think about. If I might take, Miles, a moment to expand on Ellen's point earlier. At NSF, I've been talking about this. I call it the DNA of NSF should be these two strands, that one is called the curiosity-driven, discovery-based exploratory research. That's one strand. And NSF is the exemplar of that in terms of investments on fundamental ideas with no necessarily, expecting specific things out of it necessarily. But then there has always been at NSF over the last 7 decades, in the example to show for, what I call use-inspired, solutions-focused translational research, the other strand. These two constantly interweave, intertwine, influence each other. Exploratory research influences translational research also influences exploratory. And this is a highly symbiotic, synergistic process. And I tell you, the amount of value that, you were talking about value. Let's take, for example, Google. It was a digital library project that NSF funded as a company, Google now, or Qualcomm as an SBIR project, which is now Qualcomm. Or you could take something that happened 4 decades ago that is now showing its promise. Not all will. And that's what Vannevar Bush's original conceptualization was. High risk, high reward. So risk means that some will succeed and prevail and some will not. And some will have other kinds of derivative impacts too, which we have to pay attention to. So talking about this, Miles, like you do very well, is storytelling. So I keep emphasizing how important storytelling is. You talked about Alan Alda. I had a conversation with Alan. I said, this is time for scientists, some of them, to storytell so that people might understand this, all audiences, and so that they may appreciate this more. If they appreciate this more, I bet that they will ensure that we have the support that is necessary. So I'm bullish about the future. I was called an optimist. I will take that accusation. I think that we have great, great futures ahead of us. And I'm so happy that we're having these conversations.
Here to storytelling. I'm all in favor of that one for sure. Let me throw in this next question from the audience plays into this pretty well. Because when you're telling stories and you're telling stories about basic research, I got to tell you, it can be tough sometimes, especially when you're trying to put it on television. But what are your thoughts? And why don't we do this to Neal? What are your thoughts in investment in fundamental basic theoretical research with long-term impact versus those that can show an immediate use that the public understands? Obviously, the sweet spot for government is to invest in ideas that the private sector won't. And sort of by definition, that should be more on the basic side of the equation. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think, in my younger years, which is a long time ago now, what got me to Washington was saying that the federal government wasn't spending enough money on theoretical research. My field is theoretical atomic physics. I think, but having said that, I think most any area of theoretical research that I can think about, if the researcher gives some thought to explaining to the general public what that's all about, I think that can be done. Mathematics is a difficult area. I often say one of the reasons Congress does not attack mathematics because nobody has the slightest idea what mathematicians are talking about. So there's some benefit to that. There's not a criticism of mathematics, but I think most areas of theoretical, for example, theoretical gravitational physics, the NSF program got started many decades ago. Rich Isaacson, in fact, was a program officer who, as much as anybody in the entire federal government, should be credited for getting gravitational science going. And it started with theory of folks like Kip Thorne at Caltech and funded patiently over the years. And then this idea evolved of a detector, namely LIGO. And then that had to be worked its way through OMB and the Congress. And then it took a long time, actually, when that project was approved. Nobody could commit to seeing a gravitational wave on any particular date in the future. It's astonishing. But all I'm saying is even gravitational theory, I've heard explained by the experts in ways that are compelling. They can get people excited. But then going the other direction, clearly the science that gets people's attention most immediately is the kind of science that they see connecting with what they care about in their community, in their town, and in their state, their families, and all the rest of it. So it's a much easier sell, and it's important sell. It sort of goes back to the comments made in the first panel, in our earlier panel today by the congressman, about how important it is, and some of you have said this as well, to ensure that science reaches across the country, that reaches into the rural areas, that goes into towns and counties where there isn't a scientist that anybody knows or even knows of. So the importance of conveying the excitement of science, but also the value of science and how research is done, just not understood at all. It's extremely important. It takes care. It has to be thought about by scientists. I think that can be done by theorists quite effectively, and many, in fact, your first panel today was an example of theoretical physicists who have done a great job of reaching the public with their message.
Ellen, you know, at ARPA-E, you had the you have the good fortune of creating things which are exactly, you know, ideas that are relevant to people in their lives. And I wonder, you know, if you think about, like, you look at this gadget, which we all depend on,
Yeah.
if you really start thinking about all the basic research, government funded basic research that went into this thing, it's actually very fascinating when you tell the story, and it brings it home to people. And I wonder if we are remiss at this end of the science and technology spectrum by not explaining the foundational science which actually led us to this point. And it takes a little time to tell the story, but when told right, I think it makes such a compelling argument for continuing the investment, don't you think?
I think so. When I was the head of ARPA-E, I had the pleasure of going and talking to lots of people in Congress and the Senate. And I love to talk to them about the projects, specific projects that we were doing at ARPA-E. And, you know, they're incredibly smart people, and were very interested and really asked a lot of questions. So doing that kind of storytelling is both fun for scientists and really useful for getting our enthusiasm and the importance of what we're doing across.
Do we need to, you know, do you guys have a couple of words here? Maybe we'll just cycle through here. I'll begin with you, Ellen. Is there something more that scientists should be doing? I mean, you know, I used to work at CNN, and we had an 8-person science unit for many of the years I was there. And then one day in 2008, we were gone, all of us. We just got our pink slips. So the people to call at CNN or CBS, they aren't there anymore, you know? And so it requires science to step up its storytelling game on its own in some level. Do you feel that, well, is there a call to the group listening here to do more?
Yeah, I think we need to be careful not to expect every individual scientist to be able to do that. You know, the thing about fundamental research is that people are immersing themselves in a very, very complicated, difficult field. But organizations like APS and like the universities themselves can really do a lot to help transmit that the big picture of what things are good at for, and pull out the specific stories that are easy to understand.
Peter, do you consider it part of your job to communicate it?
Absolutely, I do, because, you know, I've been a president of the Optical Society of America and of the Institute of Physics in England. One of the things that we have to do is to try to maintain the health of our discipline, and to do so is to explain to the general public what it is that physics does for you, the next door neighbor who's paying their taxes on it. So yeah, explaining, and it's back to this storytelling. I think it's really quite important that some of the things that we do might have a long-term impact, but we have been transformative in the way that we've affected people's lives. And it is our duty to do that. Some of the very best advocates are actually not old men with gray beards, but our younger people that are fantastically gifted in the way that they can communicate. And so, for example, I know about the Congressional Fellows Scheme, for example, where quite young people go into the administration and can really help in terms of illuminating it. We have a similar scheme here in the UK, working with Parliament. But I think it is our duty for all of us, if we have the time, if it's not a distraction from your core work, to explain what you do and why it's really important. And we've all got great stories about how the long-term investment in science is transformative. Equally, we've got also appalling stories of what happens if you have an immediate focus on an economic return now. And the one that I would pull out is, you know, the former East Germany had an immediate impact agenda. What did you fund that had an immediate impact? And so they became the world's experts in more efficient kettles. So
somebody's got to do it, right?
but it doesn't sustain the nation for the long term. So yes, it is our duty to do these things. And I think that when you talk to your next door neighbor who's not a scientist to explain what you do, you can really be influential in spreading the word that science is transformative.
All right, we're in bonus, but I want to finish up with Panch and Neal. Panch, go ahead. Storytelling. I used to do a series for the NSF called Science Nation. We don't do that anymore, so maybe we need to bring that back. But that's my attempt to get some more work, hustle a little.
Absolutely, Miles.
No,
Absolutely.
in all honesty, how much should the NSF be telling its story on behalf of science?
Believe me, this is something that I'm trying to emphasize a lot of NSF, and the storytelling has to happen through the people. And you talked about, should scientists do this? I think there are some really capable people who can convey this message. I mean, I had the good fortune just 2 days ago interviewing Kate Rubins, our astronaut, who's a scientist in space. This interview, she's talking about like a childlike enthusiasm. Just watching her, I'm telling you, every K12 kid who watches that will be just absolutely enamored by wanting to do something with science, right? I cannot imagine otherwise. But let me give you one last thought on this one. When I was at Arizona State University, in my previous job, I used to get undergraduate research students to talk about the excitement of what they are doing. Sometimes it is not just the faculty or the PhD students even, undergraduate students who can explain these things of what makes them excited about what they are doing in a laboratory. I tell you, I've seen legislators get taken by that rather than listening to a PhD dissertation or a faculty member talking about their research. So we need to deploy these kinds of folks who have the capacity and the capability to do this effectively. I think we need to do this more. We have to scale this up fast. As I said earlier in my response, it is our responsibility to do it. And you bet NSF is going to work hard at seeing how we can communicate our messages better through those channels.
Neal, you get the last words.
Well, the experience that Panch just described, I certainly had with members of Congress and labs where they didn't understand anything about the science, nor would I expect them to, but they had stories to take back to their colleagues on the Hill. When I was at NSF, one of my speech writers, Patricia Garfinkel, who used to write before for Congressman George Brown, coined the term civic scientist and gave me a lot of things to talk about and speeches I've been giving ever since. And I get yelled at when I started to do that by physicists, actually, who said, Neal, I work 80 hours a week. I don't have time. What do you expect me to do? And I think the point's already been made. Everybody doesn't have to do the same thing at every stage of their career. It's some people are not good at this anyway, and they can contribute to informing the public in other ways. Some are, but it's not the right time in their careers and so forth. So it's not one size fits all. It's just the community as a whole needs to engage better with the public, and that includes these policymakers who are responsible for appropriations of our research funding dollars to get the story out. So it's an important message. I find my colleagues much more open to that and much more active now than they might have been 30 years ago.
All right, that's all the time we have. Neal, Peter, Panch, Ellen, great panel. Really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you all out there did as well. I learned quite a few things. Good job, all of you. And really, thank you for being a part of this leadership council and meeting over the past few days. I'm Miles O'Brien, and I'm going to turn it back over to the boss, Jim, for some few final thoughts. Jim?
Thank you, Miles, and thank you to this scintillating panel. It was just so exciting to hear so many colleagues talk about how we're going to move this nation towards a brighter science future after coming out of this amazing and challenging epoch of the COVID pandemic, as well as the political uncertainty that has surrounded our country. So I thank this panel. But in fact, I think all of the panels and all of the presenters at the meeting this year. I'd like to acknowledge all the APS staff for their involvement in setting up this second annual leadership meeting. And I invite our members to communicate their comments, opinions, and whatever about this meeting that we're to conclude to the APS to permit improvement for the future. I think all of the people out there watching this streaming effort, many of us have been caught in front of Zoom screens for the last year, and we know that they are terribly debilitating. And yet we have these loyal physicists out there and people who are interested in the discipline who have stuck with us for 3 days, so I thank you. I'd like to remind all of the members that the APS is a membership organization that draws both its mission and strength from its members. Your active engagement is critical as the APS endeavors to support your multiple challenges as physicists and supporters of physicists. Finally, I invite you to look forward to our next ALM in about approximately a year from now. Goodbye, and may success be rewarded for all of your works. Good night.